My husband's family laughed at my poor mother's funeral. Then the lawyer read the Willa Days Okafor was 40 years old, and the afternoon she stood at her mother's graveside in the red Georgia clay of Decatur, and heard, behind her and to the left, the sound of a stifled laugh and the words, "barely nothing," exchanged between her husband's sister and his mother in the specific low register of people who believe they are being quiet and are not. Her mother had lived in the same two-bedroom house on Harmon Avenue for 31 years. She had driven a 1998 Buick until it would not start anymore. And then she had walked. She had cut her own hair. She had grown vegetables in the side yard and canned them in August and given the jars away at Christmas. The people at that graveside who did not know her well looked at the house, the Buick, the garden, and the clothing she was buried in, and drew the only conclusion they thought the evidence permitted. What her husband Warren and his family had never thought to ask, not once in 8 years of marriage, was why a woman who walked to church and gave away canned tomatoes had been meeting quarterly with an estate attorney for 19 years, or whose name appeared on the deed to 11 rental properties across DeKalb and Fulton counties, generating $43,000 a month in income. Adais had known the answer since she was 31 years old and sat across from her mother's attorney for the first time, and understood that everything she had been shown was not everything there was. The people who laughed at that graveside were still laughing when the attorney's office called to schedule the reading. What happened inside that conference room would be the last thing they ever laughed at together. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The evening light came through the kitchen window of the house on Harmon Avenue, the way it had come through that window for 31 years, at a slight angle, falling across the countertop and the row of mason jars lined up for tomorrow's canning, casting long shadows that moved almost imperceptibly as the hour advanced. Adais stood at the counter doing what her mother had asked her to do that morning before the hospital visit, which was finish the tomato preparation, because her mother had said the tomatoes would not wait for anyone's schedule. And that was simply the truth about tomatoes. She worked with her hands in the bowl and the radio on low, and her mother's apron tied around her waist. And she thought about nothing that was not directly in front of her, which was a skill she had learned from this kitchen. She had retiled the bathroom of this house herself 2 summers ago, when the original tile had cracked along the base of the shower wall, and her mother had mentioned it once, in passing, without asking for anything. Adais had come the following Saturday with the materials and her tools and spent the weekend on her knees getting it right. Her mother had looked at the finished work on Sunday evening and said that her grandfather would have done it the same way, which was the highest compliment the woman was capable of offering, because her grandfather had been a man who considered any job worth doing to be worth doing without shortcuts. Her mother, Clara Okafor, had been an accountant for 37 years, working first for a firm downtown and then, after 31, independently from the second bedroom of the house on Harmon Avenue. She had kept her clients for decades because she was precise and unflappable, and because she charged what the work was worth without apology. She had also, with the quiet patience of a woman who understood compound interest in the way that only people who calculate it professionally can understand it, been purchasing rental properties in DeKalb and Fulton counties since Adais was 9 years old. She had started with 1 duplex and a payment plan and a handshake with a property manager she trusted. And she had reinvested every dollar of income for the first 11 years and then begun drawing only a portion. And she had done this without telling anyone, because her own mother had told her once that the most useful things you own are the ones no one knows to covet. She had told Adais everything at 31. In the office of her estate attorney, a man named Theodore Lum, who had managed the estate structure since the first property was purchased. and who had greeted Adaze that morning with the particular warmth of a person who has been waiting to meet someone for a long time. Adaze had sat in that office for 2 hours and come out understanding that she was her mother's sole heir, and that the inheritance she would one day receive was not sentimental. It was structural, legal, documented, and worth more than anything she had previously imagined. She had driven home and sat in her car in the driveway for 20 minutes, and then gone inside and called her mother and said only, "I understand now." And her mother had said, "Good." And then she had asked about the tomatoes. Adaze was an accountant herself. She had her own practice in Decatur with 3 associates and a client base built on referrals from her mother's network, which turned out to be a larger and more professionally significant network than anyone outside it had any reason to suspect. She understood numbers the way her mother had understood them, not as performance, but as fact. She moved through the world without displaying what she had, because her mother had demonstrated across 31 years that display was never the point. Warren Okafor had come into her life at a professional association dinner when she was 32, charming and well-dressed and precise with his language, in the way of men who have learned that precision reads as intelligence, in rooms full of people who are not listening carefully. He was in commercial real estate finance and had the particular fluency with financial language that impressed people who did not work in finance. He had impressed her less than he intended to, which she had found interesting, and she had agreed to dinner on the strength of that alone. He had been present and engaged in the early years, and their marriage had carried a warmth that was real before it became managed. And she had loved him with the specificity that reserved people love things, quietly, and with the full weight of her attention. She had no idea he had been conducting a different life in parallel for the last 2.5 years of it. The first thing she registered without naming was a receipt she found in the pocket of a jacket she was hanging in the closet on a Tuesday evening. A hotel receipt for a property in Buckhead. 2 nights, a date that fell on a weekend. Warren had told her he was at a conference in Savannah. She held it for a moment. She placed it in the small ceramic dish on her dresser, where she kept things that required attention. She went to bed. She did not sleep until she had replayed the last 6 months carefully, in the way an accountant replays a ledger she suspects contains an error. Not with alarm, with precision. She was watching. The discovery came in full 3 weeks later, through a bank statement she was not supposed to see. Warren had accidentally forwarded a monthly account summary to their shared household email, instead of his personal account, a single error in a sequence he had clearly been managing with some care. The account was not one she recognized. The balance was $78,400. It had been opened 2 years and 4 months ago, which she cross-referenced against a date she now remembered as the month his phone had started spending more time face down on surfaces. Her hands did not shake. She printed the statement. She opened her own laptop and pulled the records of their joint account across 28 months and went through them entry by entry with the methodical calm she brought to any audit. What the review produced was a pattern that she had been trained for 20 years to identify. Irregular withdrawals at consistent intervals, disguised as separate expense categories, totaling across the full period $46,200 moved from their shared resources into the unrecognized account. She cross-referenced dates. She identified the hotel receipt as one of 11 similar entries across the same period. She built a complete timeline in a spreadsheet she named with a single word and printed and placed in a folder alongside the bank statement. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her when the numbers told a story she had not expected but could not dispute. She made one phone call to Theodore Lum, who was not only her mother's estate attorney, but the person she had trusted with the most significant financial knowledge of her life for 9 years. She said, "I need to come in. I need to bring you something." Theodore said, Wednesday morning, 8 o'clock. Some things you take to the person who already knows the most important things about you. Theodore Lum's office was in a building on Ponce de Leon Avenue that was older than most of the buildings around it and better maintained, which Adesi had always found representative of his practice. He was 67 years old, precise without being cold, and he had managed Clara Okafor's estate since before Adesi could drive. He reviewed the folder she brought, the bank statement, the joint account timeline, the hotel receipts, the spreadsheet, with the focused attention of a man reading a document that confirms something he has been watching for and hoping not to see. When he finished, he set it down. He said, "The 46,000 comes under marital dissipation. In Georgia, that is recoverable." She said she understood. He said, "The estate, as you know, is structured to be entirely outside the reach of marital proceedings. Your mother designed it that way. I have the documents to prove that design was intentional and predated every aspect of the marriage." Adesi nodded. He said, with the quiet precision of a man who had been holding this information for 9 years and was now simply confirming what both of them already knew. "He has no idea what is coming to you." She looked at Theodore across the desk and thought about her mother cutting her own hair in the same bathroom mirror for 31 years. She thought about the Buick and the canned tomatoes and the second bedroom where the numbers had been kept for decades. She thought about what her mother had told her on one of the last good evenings before the illness became the center of everything. Patience is not waiting. Patience is building while you wait. In the 10 days between the meeting with Theodore and her mother's death, Adesi retained a licensed financial investigator through a referral from her practice's legal counsel. He was methodical and quiet in his approach, which she appreciated. And what he produced in 8 days was the full picture of an account she had only seen the edge of. The $78,400 balance in Warren's separate account had not been static. It had received 43 individual deposits across 28 months, drawn from 3 sources: their joint account, a personal brokerage account Warren held that had not been disclosed during their marriage, and a third source the investigator identified as a referral fee arrangement with a commercial lender that Warren had not reported to his own firm, which constituted a conflict of interest under his employment agreement. The referral fees alone totaled $19,600 across 14 months. The investigator documented each one with the corresponding transaction records and the lender's confirmation codes. The full dissipation finding, when Phyllis Grant reviewed it, came to $46,200 in recoverable marital funds. The referral fee arrangement was a separate matter, one that Phyllis noted his firm would likely find of considerable interest once the divorce filing became public record. She drove home. She made dinner. She asked Warren how his day had been, and he told her, at some length, about a deal that was moving slowly. And she listened and asked a follow-up question, and he smiled and refilled his own glass. And she cleared the plates and said good night and went to the second bedroom and worked for 2 hours on the quarterly review for one of her larger clients. She was maintaining the surface of the life she was about to leave. She did it without visible effort, because she had always understood that the surface was never the structure, and that the structure was what determined whether a thing held when the weight came. Real power operated in quiet rooms. Her mother had proven that for 31 years, without ever making a speech about it. Clara Okafor passed on a Wednesday morning in March, in the hospital room where Adesi had been sitting since 6 a.m., holding her hand. She went quietly, in the way that people go when they have done what they came to do and are at peace with the accounting of it. Adesi sat with her for a long time after. Then she drove to the house on Harmon Avenue and walked through every room and stood in the kitchen in the early afternoon light and felt the specific weight of an absence that was also, somewhere beneath the grief, a kind of completion. The funeral was the following Saturday. Warren's family came from Marietta and Augusta, his mother, his sister, 2 brothers, an aunt, and various extensions of that constellation. They were dressed correctly and brought flowers and said the correct things in the reception line, and then, in the hour between the church and the graveside service, sorted themselves into their existing alliances and assessed the situation with the particular candor of people who believe they are unobserved. Adazi had grown up understanding that people reveal themselves most completely when they believe they are among their own, and that a woman who was quiet and peripheral at a gathering was never truly absent from it. She heard them at the graveside. The words barely nothing, the stifled sound, the exchange between Warren's sister and his mother that was over in 4 seconds, but landed with the complete precision of something that had been thought for a long time, and only now found its moment to be said aloud. She heard it. Her face remained perfectly calm. She received the condolences of 60 people across the next hour, with the grace her mother had modeled for her entire life. Unhurried, present, genuinely grateful where gratitude was genuine. She did not look at Warren's family with anything they could identify as a reaction. She looked at them with the same composed attention she brought to all things. She was not angry. She was clear. The will reading took place the following Thursday in Theodore Lum's conference room. Theodore had called on Sunday to confirm the time, and Adazi had mentioned, without drama, that she would prefer Warren's immediate family to be present for the reading, his mother and his sister specifically, as the estate would affect arrangements they had expressed interest in. Theodore, who had known her for 9 years and understood her well, had said he would arrange it. Warren arrived with his mother and his sister, and the 3 of them took seats on one side of the conference table with the settled confidence of people who have come to receive something. Warren's mother wore the particular expression of a woman who has already decided the nature of what she is about to hear. His sister sat with her coat still on. Adazi sat across from them with Theodore at the head of the table and her own attorney, a woman named Phyllis Grant, beside her. Theodore read the will in full. It was not a short document. It itemized every property by address, assessed value, and net income. 11 properties across DeKalb and Fulton counties. Combined assessed value at the time of death, $2.8 million. Combined net rental income for the prior fiscal year, $516,000. 100% of the estate transferred to Adaiz, Clara Okafor, sole heir, under a trust structure that had been in legal operation for 22 years and was in no part a marital asset under Georgia law. Theodore read each address. He read each valuation. He read the income figure. The room was very quiet. Warren's mother's expression moved through several stages that Adaiz observed and did not comment on. His sister had removed her coat sometime during the 3rd property address and had not appeared to notice doing it. Warren looked at Adaiz. He had the expression of a man doing arithmetic he had not prepared for, and arriving at an answer he could not integrate with any version of reality he had been operating in. Then Phyllis Grant set the 2nd folder on the table. She walked through the marital dissipation findings, the unrecognized account, the $46,200, the hotel receipts indexed by date, the pattern of transfers across 28 months. She did not raise her voice. She did not use a single word beyond what the documents required. She said that the divorce petition had been filed that morning, and that the dissipation finding would be the subject of a recovery motion, and that given the estate structure, the only marital asset subject to division was the equity in their shared residence, which Phyllis had already filed to address. Warren said her name. He said it the way he had not said it in years, without the management in it. He said he could explain. He said things had been complicated, that it was not what it looked like, that they could talk about this, that he had made mistakes, but that they had something worth saving. Warren's mother started to say something. Theodore Lum looked at her across the table with the gentle and absolute authority of a man who has been managing important documents for 40 years and said simply, "This is not the moment for that." She stopped. Adize looked at Warren for a long, even moment. She thought about the graveside. She thought about the words "barely nothing" in the voice of his sister, and the sound behind it, and her mother in the ground 10 feet away. She thought about 31 years of a woman cutting her own hair and walking to church and giving away canned tomatoes and building something so quietly and so completely that the people sitting in this room had laughed at the funeral. She said, "Your family stood at my mother's grave and laughed at what they thought they knew." The problem was never what they thought. The problem was what they never thought to ask. She paused. "That is the same problem you have." She stood. She picked up her bag. She thanked Theodore. She nodded to Phyllis. She walked out of the conference room without looking back. She could hear the silence filling the room behind her as the door swung closed. Her mother had built everything worth keeping, and she had taught her daughter exactly how. 5 months passed the way they do when the work ahead is larger than the work behind, steadily, with purpose, without looking over your shoulder. Adize stood on the back porch of the house on Harmon Avenue on a Saturday morning in August, her coffee mug in both hands, looking at the side garden her mother had kept for 22 years. The tomatoes had come in heavy this season. She had canned 41 jars in the past 3 weekends, working from her mother's recipe card, which was not so much a recipe as a set of instructions that assumed you already understood the important parts. She had labeled every jar in her mother's handwriting style, which she had been practicing without realizing it since childhood. She had formally taken ownership of the properties through the estate transfer that Theodore had completed in 6 weeks, with the efficiency of a man who had been ready for this moment for a decade. The property management firm her mother had used for 19 years had continued without interruption. The income had continued. The work of understanding the full picture of what she now held was the most engaging financial exercise of her professional life, and she had brought to it the same focused pleasure she had always brought to a well-ordered set of books. She had taken on a 4th associate at the practice. The client list had expanded through several of her mother's referrals, the kind that arrive when people who trusted one accountant for 30 years decide, out of something between loyalty and grief, to extend that trust to the person who inherited her files. A man named Samuel Osei had been present at the edges of her life since the spring in the way that uncomplicated people are present, without announcement, without agenda. He was a property appraiser she had met through the estate transfer process, thorough and methodical and honest in his assessments, who had said at the end of their last professional meeting that he would like to take her to dinner and had phrased it as a statement rather than a question, which she had found both accurate and refreshing. He was not performing anything. She appreciated that more than she expected to. She heard about Warren through Phyllis during a call about the final order. The marital home equity had been resolved. The recovery motion for the $46,200 had resulted in a judgment, payable over 18 months from Warren's share of the equity. His position at his firm had become complicated when the divorce filing became part of the public record, and a colleague who had long suspected a misuse of client referral funds initiated a separate internal review. He had resigned before its conclusion. His mother and his sister, whose expressions she had watched move through their stages in that conference room, were not speaking to him. The social cost of a humiliation performed publicly was, it turned out, paid by the person who had performed it. Adaize registered all of this and moved on. She had better things to attend to. She looked at the garden and thought about her mother choosing each tomato plant at the nursery with the same care she brought to every other assessment she made. Looking at the root structure, not the leaves, because that was where the information actually lived. She thought about how her mother had taught her that skill without naming it as a skill, simply by doing it in front of her for 30 years, until it became the only way Adals knew how to look at anything. She set her coffee mug on the porch railing and walked down into the garden and began the morning's work, deliberately, without hurry, the way her mother had always begun it. Bitterness required ongoing emotional investment in people who no longer deserved it. She had better returns to tend to. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.